All right, so here it is. The last example of a mobile, if underwhelming, course website, version 11. All right, so in application this time, there is still my same directories as before, but I've introduced a models directory. Let's assume that's a black box for the moment and just go into controllers. And in controllers now, let me open up lectures.php. And this now is what captures really the spirit of MVC, whereby thus far we've just had some logic and we've had views, but we haven't really done anything interesting like fetch some data and then prepare that data in some way and then pass the data to the view. The most we've done is pass in silly little strings like lecture 1 or the number n. But now, thanks to this notion of a model, we can, in my method here, call a method like getLectures. So this is a method that I've written. This is an embodiment of the M in MVC. And apparently this getLectures method is inside of a class called lecture. And I can access that class, apparently, by way of this. So for those unfamiliar, and we'll spend more time on this in the future in both PHP and JavaScript, this just refers to what again? The current object. So right now we're inside of an object, specifically a lectures object. Notice that in the line prior, I'm telling CodeIgniter, hey, load the model called lecture. And that is just referring to a file we'll see in a moment called lecture.php, capital L. And the next line, what CodeIgniter does when you call load model, quote unquote, something, it then makes that model accessible to you via that syntax. This arrow and then the model name. So you might imagine this can very quickly start to cause collisions with other names and other features of CodeIgniter. Yes, so this is one of the downsides of most any framework. They made a design decision here whereby hopefully CodeIgniter itself has no special functionality related to lectures, because we would collide in this case. But it's fairly syntactically friendly. Yeah?
So is lecture here, is that using active record or whatever CodeIgniter uses?
Sort of. So we'll talk about active record and some other paradigms before long. It's kind of bastardization of active record, whereby it kind of does that, but it's not as clean as Ruby does or as some other frameworks actually do with active record. So we'll come back to this. Active record essentially means using a PHP class that maps directly to a row in a database so that any changes you make to the object are then reflected in the database. So we'll see that before long. So it's similar. And if you actually Google around, search around on CodeIgniter's documentation, you'll see how they qualify it as sort of active record. And they actually have an active record class that's a little more similar.
Right, but this doesn't extend that extensive of the default class.
No, right. Okay. Yeah. OK, so assume for now there's a class in the world called lecture. There's a method inside of it called lectures. And what that does is it returns an array of objects. And each of those objects represents a lecture. And inside that object is going to be an ID and a name for the lecture. All right, and thereafter, what am I doing with it? Well, I'm going to do the same exact thing as before, where if I want to alter the functionality of my view, I just have to pass in more data. So this time I'm passing in data in the form of this array called lectures. And so if I now look in my view, let me go into views, lectures, index, notice that I now have this. So I've deleted the hard-coded lecture 0 and hard-coded lecture 1. I now have a for each loop. I'm iterating over the array I've passed in with lectures as lecture. And then I'm dynamically outputting on each iteration the current lecture's ID using object notation. So this is not an associative array. It's an object, hence the arrow. And then over here, I'm escaping that lecture's name. So now I no longer have to ever touch my view or my model or my controller for that matter. All I have to do is add rows to the database, which I could do sort of, I could cheat and just use PHP myadmin, or I could implement like an administrative interface that I type lecture numbers and names in to a form.
In terms of code cleanliness, is there a preference for like using PHP to generate HTML or using a template or anything?
So it's a good question. So CodeIgniter, one of CodeIgniter's proclaimed features is that they don't have a template and they don't have a template language, because typically a template language does almost the same thing as it does at least as much as you, well, it can be approximated with actual PHP. The danger in using PHP for a templating language, especially for large projects, is that you can execute arbitrary PHP code, even though it's only supposed to do things aesthetically, like spit out an ordered list or text or the like. So often in companies or in projects where you have maybe third-party developers or contractors who you want them to do the HTML work and you want them to do the design work, but you want your people who actually are more trustworthy to have access to the database and raw PHP code, then you would use a templating engine like Smarty is a very popular one, and that is purely aesthetic. And that's a little white lie. You can also execute arbitrary code, but you can disable it. So in short, CodeIgniter is nice in that you don't have to learn some arbitrary template library, but those do have value, especially for performance if you can start caching them. And there's, again, client-side versions. So what's the M? Well, the last directory in here that's new is models. And notice that there are two files. These are almost identical. And these, frankly, are some of the nuisances, I think, of CodeIgniter, where the class is called lecture, but they make you write the file name in lowercase. But this is not an uncommon PHP paradigm. So in lecture is now a class that does not extend CI controller. It extends CI model. And all this does is it implements a method called getLectures, and it uses CodeIgniter's syntax for executing a SQL query. So give me this CodeIgniter instance's database object and select both ID and name from the table called lectures and order it by ID in ascending order. And then this last query here executes, it gets the results and then returns all of them as an array. And for those unfamiliar with CodeIgniter, frankly, CodeIgniter's database library does not add all that much. This is essentially comparable, if you recall, to MySQL query, select ID, name from lectures, order by ID ascending, and then doing the equivalent of while row gets MySQL fetch assoc, fetch object of result. We'll do this, lectures gets array, lectures gets row, return lectures. So if this looks unfamiliar, all CodeIgniter is doing is simplifying what in CS50 or similar you might have done a little more manually. And so you can refer to the online documentation for their library that simplifies that. What's that? It can. So that is one of the upsides of using CodeIgniter's library. But there are, it is using something called PDO, which we'll glance at briefly today or next time. But that is among the features. You don't have to call MySQL real escape string anymore if you use a number of these abstraction libraries. Yeah?
Are we allowed to extend something like doctrine record instead of CI model? Can we use doctrine?
Yeah, if you really want. Sure. You can use other libraries if you think it lend itself to a better design. Sure. Other questions? All right, so where did the database connection come from? Just to close this loop. So when in doubt, check out the config. And in config, there's a lot of files, most of which we don't care about for now. But if I go into database, notice that most of this is comments, but I did have to fill in a few blanks. And you might have done this last week for Lab 1 when you played around with CodeIgniter then. And the last thing I had to do was this. So CodeIgniter, for performance reasons, lets you specify in its configuration what libraries do you want to load in advance so that you don't have to require once this file, this file, this file, this file, which is going to result in there being interpreted, compiled, and not used potentially. So with this line here, autoload, I'm saying I want to use a database for this particular application. Make sure that this arrow DB is accessible to me. So when diving into Project Zero, don't get distracted as best you can by this sort of CodeIgniter specific stuff that's not all that intellectually interesting. Much more interesting to take away from this thus far is the fact that you have these models in one directory, controllers in another, views in another, and how they intercommunicate by way of method calls from one to the other. That's the interesting idea. Any questions? All right, let's take a 5-minute break. All right. So everyone's awake now, but to help maintain that state, we've propped open some windows with erasers. So hopefully that will help here. And I'll get more interesting. All right. So now we get to have more fun design discussions, hopefully, specifically in the context of databases. So we spent some time reviewing the design docs and style guides that have come in over the past couple of days. Do realize that you're welcome to forge ahead now with your partner. That your teaching fellow will be assigned later today. So you'll get an email specifying who your teaching fellow will be. If you have very pressing concerns, you're welcome at that point to email him or her to find out some answers. But we'll also get back to you over the next day or two with any glaring deficiencies that we felt might exist in your design. But do not feel obliged to wait on us. So, databases. So this is something you'll likely make use of for this project or for some future project, whether it's in the form of a MySQL database, which is probably going to prove to be the common case, totally fine, very reasonable. You might end up choosing, in the context of iOS later on in the semester, SQLite, which allows you to store an entire SQL database in a single binary file on disk, or in the case of iOS, on the iOS device itself. But you can still execute queries on it, even though it's not a server that's actually running. It's just a binary file. But all of these databases, whether in MySQL form or SQLite form, are relational in nature. And what does this mean? Well, it means that you can think of them, frankly, like Excel spreadsheets with tables that have rows and columns.